This video is brought to you by MagicJank.com, the spiciest cards for your sauciest decks. Buy and sell Magic the Gathering products and gear today on MagicJank.com. What is up, Janksters? It's your boy Graham, also known as HamHawks42 on the internet, and today I want to do something special. Because there's a lot of discussion going on around the reserve list right now. It is a list of cards that Wizards of the Coast promised to never reprint. It's actually a list of over 570 cards that were printed back in the 90s in some of those older sets. Now, the Power 9, the original dual lands are on this list, and those get a lot of attention, with good reason. They're incredibly powerful cards that are auto-includes in any deck that can support them in any format where they're legal, of which there are very few, to be fair. But, needless to say, they're highly in demand, and they were only printed in the 90s, and Wizards has promised to never reprint them again. So naturally, their collector value is very, very high. However, the reserve list is over 570 cards, and as a result, there are some real duds on there that, frankly, we don't mind that Wizards will never reprint them. And today, I want to take a look at 10 of those cards, and just appreciate the fact that these will not be coming back, because they are stone cold unplayable. Now, in doing research for this, I did not painstakingly comb through every single reserve list card, so I have absolutely no doubt I've missed a couple. Please let me know in the comments below what your favorite reserve list stinker is, because I want to see them, because there is some funny stuff out there. But with that, let's get into my top 10 list of reserve list stinkers that we're glad aren't going to get reprinted anytime soon. Coming in at number 10, we have Mercenaries. Now, this card is very straightforward. It's pretty simple compared to a lot of the other ones we're going to be looking at today. Because as you can imagine, when Magic was first coming out, it was still trying to identify kind of its, well, mechanical identity, exactly how the game would flow. And there were some growing pains early on. And Mercenaries was one design that I find fascinating, even though it's relatively straightforward. This is a 3/3 for 4. It has been eroded to a human, for what that's worth. So 3/3 for 4, it's not great on stats, but okay, what do we get for that? Whenever Mercenaries damages a player, that player may pay 3 to prevent that damage. So it's bad on stats, and your opponent can pay mana to fog it and prevent its damage. I gotta say, this card is just straight trash. There isn't a single deck that would want this. By today's standards, definitely, but even by standards back in the day, like, it's easy to look at cards like Shivan Dragon or the Mahamoti Djinn and those kind of things and realize, like, oh my goodness, this card was great back then. And even then, like, nowadays it's okay, but like back then it was awesome. This, I have no doubt, even back in the day, people didn't like this. Like, like this thing is, like, I know a 3/3 body is easy to underrate, like, it is relevant in combat, but not when your opponent can just dump a little bit of mana they have lying around in to prevent the damage. Because this is, like, your opponent doesn't care about blocking this, and it's a 3/3 that comes out on turn 4. It doesn't have haste or anything. It's not swinging before turn 5. Again, even in older decks where you don't have access to some of the newer power crept cards, like, yeah, nowadays we're getting 6/6s for 5, or even 6/6s for 4 that, like, have negligible or, you know, negligible downsides or straight up upsides. So this thing is, like, it's a 3/3 for 4 with a downside. And it's funny, we think white has it bad now. Woof. Coming in at number 9, we have Lightning Cloud. Now, before I get into the mechanics of the card, I do have to say, the artwork on this is gorgeous. If you've never had the privilege of driving down a country road and being able to see a storm roll in from out in the distance, it is a beautiful sight to behold. And Lightning Cloud here kind of like shows the most extreme version of that, with, of course, just way more lightning than any one cloud could possibly deliver. But it's a fantasy world, so it's magic, hand wavium. That's okay. Still cool to look at. Great, beautiful piece of art. Well done. John Matson, well played. Now, the card itself, it's unfortunate that such a cool piece of art is attached to such a terrible card. It is an enchantment for 3 and a red. You may pay 1 red. Lightning Cloud deals 1 damage to target creature or player. And I believe this is actually, yeah, this has been eroded to any target, so it can hit Planeswalkers as well. When this was first printed, Planeswalkers weren't a card type, so a lot of the time they said creature or player, meaning anything. Anyway. Use this ability only when a red spell is successfully cast, and only once for each such spell. So what this is, it is a separate activated ability on the enchantment that kind of gives all your spells kicker, where you can pay 1 additional red to deal 1 additional damage. Now, being able to just tap one mana and deal 1 damage is good in theory. You know, a lot of red decks just need to count to 20 as fast as they possibly can, and anything that can provide additional damage to the face is usually worth it. The problem with this is it has an initial investment of 4. Any mono red players out there know, like, your curve should be stopping at 3 in most of those decks, like, if you even have 3 drops. And if you have a 4 drop, you're gonna want to be playing something like Torbrand that just, like, straight ends the game when it hits, you know, if you have any semblance of a board state. Like, this is like, this is rough. Like, it's just rough. It gives all your spells kind of a kicker 1. That's not where you want to be. Nobody wants to be there. Coming in at number 8, we actually have a pretty interesting design that I like in theory, but again, the mana value just isn't there. This is Chaos Harlequin. For 2 red, you get to summon Harlequin, which actually looks like it's been eroded to a human, which is a little unfortunate if you ask me. I think creature type Harlequin is pretty sweet. But it's a 2/4 for 2 red. Pay 1 red, remove the top card of your library from the game. If that card is a land, Chaos Harlequin gets -4, -0 until end of turn. Otherwise, Chaos Harlequin gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Now, chaotic effects like this, where you end up kind of at the whim of your top deck, or you literally have to flip a coin or roll dice, like, I find those effects to be really fun, because you get those cool, exciting moments where it's like, well, do I have lethal? I don't know. Let me activate this and find out, which is kind of Red's deal. Well, it's one of Red's deals. You know, and I like that. It's a kind of a cool dynamic it can create for some very interesting, fun gameplay that is fairly inconsistent, so it's not the kind of thing you want to run in competitive, but in, like, commander style games, this can actually be really fun. The problem with it is, if you're running multiple, like a deck that has a decent chunk of lands, like say a third of your deck is lands, yes, if you pump some mana into this, there's a decent chance you're going to get some kind of stat buff. But the part of the problem with that is, if you had a land pocket, your Chaos Harlequin might end up having negative power. Because that's the thing, your power can be negative. The creature doesn't die by having negative power. So if you pay 1, immediately hit a land, all of a sudden your Chaos Harlequin is a -2/4. You're not doing anything with that. Your best case scenario, you hit another red and you don't hit a land on top. If you do, then all of a sudden -6/4 that you've now sunk 6 mana into. Like, it's just so inefficient for this, like, goofy, chaotic effect. And best case scenario, if you do hit it on 4, you say you activate it twice the following turn again, but you hit non-lands both times, 1, you've now exiled 2 non-land cards that you were going to draw, so you will lose those cards forever. And what you get is a +4/+0 boost. You now have a 6/4, which, granted, a 6/4 in combat can do a lot, but that's a 6/4 you just spent 6 mana on. And there's no guarantee you got there. Like, that feels really bad. Really bad. So you have to somehow, like, stack your deck to get some kind of effect off this. In a world where Goblin Charbelcher exists, why in the world would you ever play Chaos Harlequin? And by the fact that this card hasn't been reprinted since the 90s, Wizards has promised to never reprint it, and you can go to any Magic the Gathering marketplace that has this in stock, and you can buy a copy for less than $1, tells me nobody wants to be running this. It's just not good. Is it fun? Maybe. Is it worth it? No. Speaking of cards that just aren't worth it, coming in at number 7, we have Minion of Tevesh Szat. Now, Tevesh Szat is actually kind of a cool character. He's one of the bad guys from, like, the old school lore. He recently got a card in Commander Legends, recent as of this recording. And, like, cool character. He's got a lot of thralls, a lot of demons kind of thing going on. Cool. Groovy. I mean, I'm here for it. But Minion of Tevesh Szat, this is a 4/4 for 7. 4 black. Now, at that rate, what's in this text box better be frickin' awesome. So let's check it out. During your upkeep, pay black, or Minion of Tevesh Szat deals 2 damage to you. Okay, so kind of this, like, kind of bad upkeep situation. Again, if the rest of the text box is worth it, cool. Tap, target creature gets +3/-2 until end of turn. Now, that can kill creatures with low toughness just by tapping. And if you can somehow give minion of Tevesh Zot Vigilance and attack, and if it's unblocked, you could then tap it to make it a 7/2, which your opponent will then proceed to shock. But like, for 7 mana, Avatar of Woe exists? So why in the world would you ever play Minion of Tevesh Zot? Now, granted, like, I understand this is an old card. This is from Ice Age. So, of course, things were different back in the day. But even so, a 4/4 for 7, 3 of which is colored mana, for a creature with an upkeep and a bad tap ability. Like, it's awful on stats. The ability is fine, but definitely not worth the, the juice isn't worth the squeeze here. And then it also has an upkeep on top of it. I mean, it is a demon, so, and it's actually been eroded to a demon minion. So if you have any kind of demon minion synergies, I guess that's something. But again, here we have a reserve list card that will never be reprinted again, that you can get for $1 or less than $1. I find this thing fascinating. Again, art's pretty sweet. Like, I do love old school Magic art, and that's kind of fun. But yeah, like, the creature looks terrifying until it hits the board and you realize, oh, I can deal with this just in 10,000 different ways and just not care. Coming in at number 6 is a Heart Wolf. This is a 2/2 for 3 and a red with First Strike. First Strike, highly underrated mechanic in my opinion. So, okay, like, bad on stats so far, but let's see what else we got. It also has an ability, tap, target dwarf gains First Strike and gets +2/+0 until end of turn. If that dwarf leaves play this turn, bury Heart Wolf. Use this ability only when attack or defense is announced. That's been eroded, by the way, to tap, target dwarf creature gets +2/+0 and gain First Strike until end of turn. When that creature leaves the battlefield this turn, sacrifice Heart Wolf, activate only during combat. So, like, the original wording is a little clunky by today's rulings and the way that the rules currently work, so they did modify it slightly. Flavorfully, I like this card a lot. The whole idea is, like, the dwarf hops on the wolf's back and they ride into battle together. So it gives the First Strike ability to the dwarf. Also, it's only, dwarf creatures because it's a wolf, not a horse. So, like, okay, the creature has to be somewhat smaller. I think it would be really fun if they eroded this. Not that anyone's calling for this, because it's, like, very clearly an unplayable card. But I think this would be really fun if they eroded this. So all of a sudden, like, Kithkin could hop on it too. Like, I think that would be neat. It's so not worth it, but it would be fun. We also have, like, gnomes and halflings now in as creature types, so, like, why not let them hop on this thing? This card is flavorfully A+, playability F-. This is, like, it's so rough. I think when this card first came out, Wizards maybe thought dwarves would be more of a thing, and then they definitely stopped. In the early 2000s, like, there were very few dwarf cards printed, and the ones that did see printing were very rough. It wasn't really until we got back to Kaladesh that, like, dwarves started really kind of becoming their own thing. And interestingly enough, they kind of became their own thing with vehicles. Like, you have a lot of dwarf pilots in Kaladesh, which is kind of fun and also kind of fitting when you think of, like, typical dwarves being, like, tinkerers and miners. Like, okay, so them piloting vehicles, all right, not that big of a stretch as far as, like, our Tolkien sensibilities would have it. But I find it interesting that dwarves took so long to get kind of a mechanical identity, and Heartwolf here was trying to give them one early, and it's pretty rough. I mean, giving your creature First Strike at +2/+0 is no joke, but on a 4-drop that you then have to tap and risk is the other thing. With other creatures that provide some kind of benefit to an attacker, you tap them and buff the attacker, then the attacker swings in. If the attacker dies, the thing that buffed it doesn't care. But the fact that Heartwolf straight up dies if that other creature leaves the battlefield. Also, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, Barry specifically says, oh, it's been replaced with a sacrifice effect in the errata. When you bury a creature, it can't be regenerated, which is an older way to save creatures in situations like this. So Heartwolf just if somebody bounces that dwarf after you've provided the buff, then Heartwolf just dies. Like, it just dies. That's, like, ouch. Just big ouch. In red aggressive decks. Well, and we saw this with Lightning Cloud too. You can't afford to be playing 4-drops that don't make an immediate impact on the board. And this, it's a bad combat trick on a body. Like, so it gives your opponents more opportunities to interact with it. You don't get the buff before turn 5. Like, yeah, no, this is just rough. Coming in at number 5, we actually have a style of card that is near and dear to my heart that is, well, unplayable. That's the theme of the day, right? And that is Marjhan, or Marjhan, or I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that. I think it's Marjhan. Marjhan is an 8/8 serpent for 7, 5 blue. So unlike most other creatures we've been looking at today, the stats on this so far look pretty good. But you will notice there is a Dickensian novel in this text box. Let's see what we got. And actually, I'm gonna go ahead and just read the Oracle text straight away rather than try to parse the old school text, because this is like 3-point font, if not 2-point font, like super tiny. And it's the contrast makes it pretty difficult to read. I do have the Oracle text up here. Let's take a look at that. So it plays today as Marjhan doesn't untap during your untap step. All right, it's a big creature. You got a downside. Also, big creature in blue. Okay, we're gonna have a downside. That's okay. Pay blue, sacrifice a creature, untap Marjhan, activate only during your upkeep. So that's how we untap this creature built in. You do have to feed it, otherwise it can't do anything. Okay. Marjhan can't attack unless defending player controls an island. You could also play blue. Marjhan gets -1, -0 until end of turn and deals 1 damage to target attacking creature without flying. Ah, okay, that's something. And then, when you control no islands, sacrifice Marjhan. So this card is a gigantic blue sea serpent. That is something, there are a lot of old blue cards that are like Leviathans, sea serpents, just monsters of the deep in various ways. And usually they're very, very large, but they have some massive downside. You have your Leviathans, your Polar Krakens, your Dandans. They're all really cool cards in their own right, and Marjhan is definitely amongst them. The fact that you do actually get an 8/8 that can block freely for 7 in blue is actually not bad. Like, it's okay. And on top of that, if you have blue mana lying around when your opponent attacks you, you can actually dump it into this little effect that can actually blast your opponent's attackers. Like, of all the cards we looked at today, this one I can almost make a case for. The problem is, you get all of that at the intro cost of 7 mana. There are so many better things you can be doing with 7 mana right now, it's not even funny. And to give you an idea of kind of where power creep is, we also have, I don't know, Hullbreaker Horror at 7 mana, which is a 7/8 that can attack freely, that doesn't give a crap if any players control an island, and it has like additional upside if you're casting other spells. Granted, power creep's a thing. The cards were printed more than 20 years apart. Like, Marjhan might have been playable back in the day, like in some kind of weird control situation, because it does. One thing it gives you is it puts a card on the battlefield that your opponent can't reasonably attack into, which is ultimately what control decks want. Granted, they want that on turn like 3 or 4, not on turn 7, but still, it's like, you can almost make a case for it. It's not quite there though. It's just so freaking expensive, and the downsides are all very real. Because how often are you gonna have a creature lying around that you can sacrifice to this thing? Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the art. It is a sea serpent eating what appears to be a humpback whale. How big is this thing if it's just chowing down on a humpback whale that looks bite-sized by comparison? Freaking cool. Like, I love that. But yeah, I have a soft spot for like the gigantic sea serpents from back in the day, because most of them are kind of unplayable, but at the same time, I can see why Timmy players back in the day really got excited for these. Like, I see the appeal. Coming in at number 4, we have Malignant Growth. This card, it speaks for itself. I'm just gonna jump right in. It is an enchantment for 3 green blue. Cumulative upkeep 1 colorless. During your upkeep, put a growth counter on Malignant Growth. During target opponent's draw phase, he or she draws an additional card for each growth counter on Malignant Growth. For each card that opponent draws in this way, Malignant Growth deals 1 damage to him or her. So if you're not familiar with cumulative upkeep, what happens is on your upkeep step, you put a time counter, I believe it's time counter, age counter, you put a counter on the permanent that has a cumulative upkeep. You then pay the cumulative upkeep, whatever the cost is, for how many counters are on it. So in this case, you drop your 5-drop Malignant Growth, go around the turns, cruise through the turn cycle. You then put 1 counter on it, and then pay 1. You've now invested 6 mana into Malignant Growth and have had no effect on the board. Then you pass to your opponent. They hit their upkeep. They take 1 damage from this, but then draw an additional card. Next turn rolls around. You have to pay 2 mana into this. Then pass to your opponent. They take 2 damage from this and draw 2 additional cards. So what you're doing is you are pinging your opponent, and it is ramping up over time. However, as the damage is ramping up over time, you are also having to sink more and more mana into this every single turn, restricting your resources, while also giving your opponent extra cards. I don't know if you've ever played a game of EDH with a Phyrexian Arena down, or a Graveborn Muse, which is one of my favorite EDH cards, love it, or even a Sizan Perverter of Truth, which recently skyrocketed in value. Thank you, Shieldred the Apocalypse. People are more than happy to take some damage, lose a little bit of life, to draw extra cards. 1 card in your hand is worth so much more than 1 damage. It just is. And so the fact that in order to get good use out of this, you have to dump a friggin' 14, how much mana? So much mana into this. And throughout the process, you're giving your opponent extra cards. Like, you're just giving your opponent so many opportunities. Like, this card lets your opponent dig for their enchantment removal so they can just appreciate the 5 or 6 cards you drew them, and then they blow it up before it kills them. Like, it's so bad. And on top of that, you have to pay repeatedly to take advantage of this. This is dumb. This card is so silly. Like, I understand that green and blue don't usually have like direct face damage. That's not something that those colors do. But at the same time, not like this, man. You don't want it like this. All right, we are getting into the top 3. And at number 3, we have Emberwild Caliph. Now, this is a Djinn. It is a 4/4 flying trampler for 2 blue-red. Now, for it to be this high on the list, there's got to be a massive downside, because as far as stats to mana value is concerned, this is the best we've seen all day. 4/4 flying trampler for 4. Like, that could be playable by today's standards, depending on what else is going on in that text box. So let's see what Emberwild Caliph's got going on. It attacks each turn of Fable. Not that big of a deal, because let's be honest, that's probably what we wanted to do anyway. That's text that we see on a lot of modern cards that are still playable, because if they're aggressive in nature, it's not that big of a downside. But then here's the kicker: for each 1 damage Emberwild Caliph successfully deals, lose 1 life. You will note the 1 damage that Caliph deals does not have to be against your opponent. It could be on a creature, could be on a planeswalker, doesn't freaking matter. If this creature is dealing damage, you are losing life equal to the damage it's dealing. This is so bad. Like, the way that this is, the way that you're hoping to use this is in a hyper-aggressive strategy where your life total is going to be higher than your opponent's because you've been dealing them damage throughout the course of the game. But even so, if I'm at 20 life and I've got my opponent down to 10, let's say, by the time Emberwild Caliph hits, because I'm in a primarily red aggressive deck. Okay, fine. Emberwild Caliph hits, all of a sudden, okay, my opponent now is on, at the very least, a 3-turn clock, and in all likelihood, probably a 2-turn clock. But I'm choosing to get blasted for 4 every single time this thing attacks, even if it gets blocked. What? Like, that's such a hit. If your opponent wipes the board and then stabilizes, all of a sudden you just gave them a huge advantage by dropping your own life total to down to 16, potentially 12 if you got 2 shots with this. I mean, it puts you, the aggressor, on a clock. That's not how these cards are supposed to work. I love the idea of this to some degree, the idea that it'll hurt you for using it, but at the same time, the fact that it's 1 for 1 is so rough. Could you imagine taking this thing down with a fight spell? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna target my 5/5 and your Emberwild Caliph for with some generic fight spell. So not only am I killing your Emberwild Caliph, but I'm also blasting you in the face for 4 because it hit my creature that just shrugged the damage off like it was no big deal. Come on. It's such an epic downside. I have no doubt this was playable back in the day in some decks, but it definitely isn't anymore. At the number 2 spot, we have a card that I'm actually the proud owner of 1 copy. If you've been playing Magic for a number of years like I have, you probably have some bulk lying around, and you have some cards in there where you literally look at them and just go, how the heck did you get here? And I have 1 copy of Vidalian War Machine that is very much in that situation. I didn't open Fallen Empires back in the day. I genuinely have no idea how I got it, but it's there. I certainly didn't trade for this thing. Anyway, I think it's hilarious. I find this card endlessly fascinating. It is a wall. So this is summon wall. It has defender. Back in the day, wall creature types couldn't attack. They changed it to defender later on, just to kind of make the mechanics a little smoother. That way you didn't have creature types that had mechanical weight outside of tribal synergies, which makes a lot of sense. So I'm glad they did that. In any event, it's been errata to have defender. It is a 0/4 for 1 blue. At any time, you may pay 0, tap target merfolk you control to allow Vidalian War Machine to attack this turn, or to give Vidalian War Machine +2/+1 until end of turn. If Vidalian War Machine is put into the graveyard, if it dies, all merfolk tapped in this manner this turn are destroyed. So this is very similar to Heartwolf in how it's functioning. So what this does is a bunch of merfolk climb inside this thing, and the more of them there are, you need 1 pilot just to be able to make it attack, and the more of them there are, the stronger it is, and they crash into battle, but if the whole thing goes down, they all die. And think about that for a second. At best, you're getting +2/+1. So if you have 2, you tap 2 merfolk, you take 2 creatures, 2 relevant creatures, presumably, take them out of combat, make it to, effectively crew this thing. Modern days, this would definitely be a vehicle, but vehicles didn't exist back in the day. This becomes a 2/5 that can attack as though it didn't have defender, that you have now tapped 2 creatures for and spent 3 mana on. Frankly, a 3 mana 2/5? I'm not even playing that, and that's what you get when you tap that many merfolk. This doesn't have Island Walk. It doesn't have flying. Not that it would make sense for it to have flying per se, but there's no evasion. There's no trample. Trample would kind of make sense, right? It's theoretically a gigantic war machine. I know trample's not necessarily in Blue's wheelhouse, but still, something. Give me something here. So the best case scenario, you invest your whole team to create 1 big vanilla creature, and if your opponent hits it with 1 Doomblade or Terror if you're playing old school, your whole board is dead. And if nothing else, they can just chump block it. So what did you get? You're probably still much better off attacking with your merfolk rather than crewing the Vidalian War Machine. This card is just straight awful. Mechanically, it just does absolutely nothing. Now, I do love the artwork. It's showing kind of this whimsical merfolk war machine. It's got kind of a carnival vibe, which I kind of dig. Amy Weber actually did a lot of old school Magic art that is just kind of fun and different from a lot of other stuff out there. So I appreciate that. But at the end of the day, this card is just stone unplayable, and that is why it is number 2 on this list. My goodness, vehicles have changed. They have changed oh so much. So here we are at the much coveted number 1 spot of reserve list cards. We are super stoked Wizards will never reprint. And this is a doozy. This is one that actually, in researching this video, I read it a couple of times. I'm like, there's no way. There's no way this is this bad. And it absolutely is. And that is Slintering Wind. It is an enchantment for 2 green with an activated ability. Pay 2 into green. Total investment is 7 for this. Just keep that in mind. Splintering Wind deals 1 damage to target creature. Put a splinter token into play. Treat this token as a 1/1 green creature with flying and cumulative upkeep 1 green. If this token leaves play, it deals 1 damage to you and to each creature you control. So the idea of having an enchantment that can just straight up deal damage and put tokens into play seems really, really cool, right? Like, in theory, that's great, but the problem is if you use it. So you use it once. You've now spent 7 mana to deal 1 damage. You possibly kill like a 1/1 or some kind of X1 creature on your opponent's board. Fine. 7 mana for that is just absurd, frankly. But, okay, you're in green, you may be ramped. Okay, fine. And then you put this 1/1 token with, it's a 1/1 flyer into play. Okay, green doesn't usually have access to flyers, with a couple of exceptions, usually bees. And so, okay, fine. You get a little 1/1 flyer. That's not bad, okay. But that flyer has a cumulative upkeep of a green. So when you hit your next turn, you have to pay 1 green in order to keep it around. And then the turn after that, you have to pay 2, then 3, etc. Like, so it just becomes incredibly expensive to take care of just this 1 flyer. And if you dump even more mana into this, if you dump 10 mana into this, you get 2 of those little flyers, all for the benefit of being able to deal 2 damage to your opponent's stuff. But if at any point you can't pay the upkeep for those little splinters, they damage you and damage each other. So if you dump an obscene amount of mana into this thing to create 4 splinters, all of a sudden you have kind of exponential cumulative upkeeps that you're trying to maintain just for a couple of 1/1 flyers. And then once you can't pay one of them, they blast you in the face plus the whole squad and any other creature that you have lying around. And the moment one of them dies, it kills all of the other ones because they're all 1/1s. And then those trigger dealing additional damage to you and all your stuff. So the upside of this card is you get to direct damage on your opponent's creatures, which is not something that you get to do in green very often. Okay, but it's incredibly expensive, and the downside is you're literally putting a frickin' bomb on your own side of the battlefield that only hits you. Like, if the splinters exploded and dealt 1 damage to all creatures, then it could at least wipe your opponent's board. Instead, it's only wiping yours. Like, the amount of mana you have to invest for such a crappy payoff with this card is just mind-blowing. So I found this card fascinating, and this was printed in Alliance. Same set as Force of Will, by the way. So like, old school cards are so fascinating because you get some of the most busted, overpowered cards of all time, and then you get crap like this. Like, I find it absolutely fascinating. Again, Magic was going through some growing pains, trying to figure out its identity mechanically, and I think it's landed on a very good spot. Obviously, the game is just continuing to grow and just be wildly popular. And so I'm glad that they've moved away from things like this, because, my goodness. Even if this activated ability only costs 1 green, I still wouldn't like this card. But the fact that it costs 3 is just staggering. Seriously, what is this? Thank you so much for watching till the end of the video. I want to give a huge thank you to my lovely patrons. Angry Jellyfish, Else89, thank you so much for the support. It means the world. You also can donate for as little as $1 a month over on Patreon to help me produce more content like this. It would mean the world. Thank you for considering that. I also want to give a huge thank you to magicjank.com. They sponsored this video as well as all the videos on the channel. They are a Magic the Gathering marketplace where you can buy and sell singles, packs, sleeves, dice, you name it. If it is Magic adjacent, they got it. So please check out magicjank.com. There's a link in the description below. And yeah, tell them Ham sent you.